Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second public event of the Transversal Translation Collective. And first of all, even though this event is remote, before we begin, we want to recognize and acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania, our institutional sponsor, stands on the indigenous territory known as Lenapehoking, which is the traditional homelands of the Lenape, also called La Lenape or the Delaware Indians. And these are the people who during the 1680s negotiated with William Penn to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. And we see this acknowledgement as just one small step towards actual material reparations to Indigenous peoples and their descendants. And to that end, in a very gradual way, I'm going to drop some links in the chat for anyone who'd like to learn more or connect with folks at Penn, creating awareness of Native history and contemporary issues. And especially a big thank you to the Native Alumni Association for putting together this information about the land on which we do our work. I also would like to point out that this event coincides with a protest surrounding the desecration of the remains of children who grew up in the MOVE organization in Philadelphia. The MOVE organization is an organization for Black liberation and revolutionary action that the city of Philadelphia bombed, causing a fire that razed an entire city block, not very far from where I'm sitting right now. And Liz and I and many others, of course, have been appalled by the fact that the remains of children who were murdered in this event were kept on university premises, used in university coursework at the University of Pennsylvania and at Princeton. And we've also been appalled by the way that the university and the university's attempts at apologies has ended up centering the university itself, interrupting events by MOVE members, speeches by MOVE members. And so in this event, we want to hold space for the way that artistic creation interacts with this moment in the history of the place that defines our collective's identity in Transversal. And we want to hold space to think about the way that university resources are corrupted and can be co-opted. And in terms of those resources, we'd like to thank the organizations that have made this event possible and made these discussions possible. That includes the Poetry and Poetics Working Group and the Program in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory. And we'd like to give a special thank you to Joanne Dubel, the program coordinator, and Emily Wilson, the graduate chair in comparative literature, for their ongoing work to support conversations around translation at Penn for students like myself and Liz, who will now get us going with this event.
Thanks, Hila. I just want to tell you all a bit about Transversal, which is the translation collective that's hosting this event. We're so excited to have support like this because we're a group that is led by emerging translators and emerging scholars. And we are founded in the fall of 2020 with the specific aim of being a really big tent. So we're not defined by language combinations, academic positions, or even experience levels. Like Hila said, we're affiliated with Kelly Writer's House and the program in comparative literature at Penn. And most of our members are based nearby, but we also have active members on multiple continents. And together we hold weekly focused work sessions on Zoom. And before each session, we check in and offer each other new connections and resources. And every month or two, we hold a workshop or an internal reading to polish our translation work. So we're also just starting to have more public-facing events like this one. This is our second public event, which will go till around 7:15 Eastern time. And I'll ask that you all hold your questions until the Q&A portion around 6:45. I encourage everyone in the audience to also pin Achy and Adrienne to have a better viewing experience by going to the upper right-hand corner of their screens and clicking pin. Both of our guests today are incredible translator writers. Achy Obejas is the author of Tower of the Antilles, which was nominated for a Penn Faulkner Award, among many other honors. Her novels include Ruins and Days of Awe, which was a Los Angeles Times Best Books of the Year. Her poetry chapbook, This Is What Happened in Our Other Life, was both a critical hit and a national bestseller. And as a translator, Havana-born Achy has worked with Wendy Guerra, Rita Indiana, Junot Díaz, and Maxwell, among many others. A recipient of a USA Artist Fellowship, an NEA and Cintas Fellowship, among other awards. She's currently a writer and editor for Netflix and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Adrienne Perry grew up in Wyoming, earned her MFA from Warren Wilson College and her PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston. From 2014 to 2016, she served as editor of Gulf Coast. A Hedgebrook alumna, Adrienne is also a Convilio Fellow and a member of the Rabble Collective. Adrienne's writing has received support from Friends of Writers, Elizabeth George Foundation, Imprint, and the University of Houston. In 2020, Adrienne received the inaugural Elizabeth Alexander Prize in Creative Writing from Meridian's Journal. Adrienne's work has appeared or is forthcoming in Copper Nickel, Black Warrior Review, Indiana Review, Ninth Letter, and elsewhere. She's assistant professor of literature and creative writing at Villanova University. Because this event is about the intersections of translation and creative writing, our guests have generously agreed to share short excerpts of their work at the beginning and end of our discussion today. And so we're going to start with Adrienne. So Adrienne, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Liz and Hila, for those introductions, and everybody for being here. I was thinking today as I was getting ready, it's a crazy time. When hasn't it been a crazy time? I don't know, but it feels like the heat keeps getting turned up on the pot. So I just want to say thanks for being here, wherever you're at, physically, spiritually, just really glad to be with you. So I'm going to read an excerpt from my novel in progress. It's called See-Through Girls. And the connection between this novel and this project in translation is that, as I was sort of working on my dissertation and thinking about what I wanted to do as a writer, I'd been taking classes on translation and hanging out with translators in Houston. And I decided, well, how about I pay homage to Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man, by doing, I'm going to do an English to English translation of Invisible Man. It was one of those things that I wasn't drunk, but I just really felt like this sort of spirit of experimentation and playfulness that I found in doing translation. I wanted to sort of bring that to this other project. So you may hear some traces of Invisible Man in this, and we can talk more about it later. So this is just the beginning of the novel, and I'll just say that there are two protagonists, Amy and Jenny, and they're college students at an unnamed, I think in this part of the excerpt, unnamed women's college somewhere on the Upper West Side of New York. You can fill in the blank, I'm guessing. Anyway, here we go. We were girls you could see through. Nothing extraordinary about us, nothing supernatural like in a sci-fi freak show fantasy. We had thighs and torsos, clavicles we could pinch, boobs no bigger than a C cup until it came time for our monthlies. Wild. What non-brown, non-down folks might could call the hair we teased and waxed into bushy plumes. Beneath that in-your-face hair, what? Exquisite brains, lustrous as black pearls. Problem was, most folks weren't checking for us, at least not in that way. Teachers? Not really. No compatriots, no strangers on the downtown 1 train, no boyfriends or girlfriends. Nobody knows the kind of trouble I've seen but Jesus, kind of nobody. Amy and I were like extras in the make you want to slit your own throat movie adaptation of antebellum slave life. Ooh, the plantation. Oh, how good white folks love to cry over the bad old days, to weep at every whip crack at their local AMC theater. Holy Mary, Mother of God. Neither house nor field in our blockbuster cast me and Amy in the gray space because we are mixed, meaning we might look like house Negroes, but all the while we're plotting with the Maroons how to steal enough of Massa's guns to flip the script and get everybody the hell out. I predict an indie hit. I predict the cameras roll, but only catch our shadows. Ha ha, you punks can't see us. 2013. One September night after the start of the fall semester sophomore year, Amy and I walked back from a concert in Harlem, just past 125th Street to Morningside Heights. The warmish, silky air lotioning our arms felt too good for a subway ride. Along Amsterdam, purple pansies and yellow mums planted around caged tree trunks looked up at us with their cute, bright faces. Rats scurried near brick walls. crawled over trash bags supers hadn't bothered to twist tight. Arm in arm, we giggled. No talking, just swaying side to side as we remembered the Sega music and the dancing we'd done, our feet never leaving the floor. The sweet and spiced rum drinks we'd sipped in corners. The music and the drinks and the memory of them rippled through our limbs like burnt sugar. Turning the corner on 118th, we saw the figure of a woman. She was heading toward us, walking down the middle of the sidewalk like it was a catwalk, practically hogging all the cement. We were two, she was one, and as we got closer, a confirmed white girl, though the way she took up space had already said it all. Amy and I tightened our arms into a lock, refused to redirect our path. This was our unspoken understanding. Never, ever, never, ever, ever, ever cede your position on the sidewalk to oblivious white folks. Don't step to the side, don't skip into the street. Folks gotta learn. The woman was tall like Amy, professional looking, thighs carved by exercise pressed taut heels into her tight, neutral skirt. The bones below Amy's elbow pushed against my skin. Gold, Jenny from the block hoop earrings caught the street lights and cast half moons on the woman's dimpled cheeks. I braced myself for impact. Thud. She rammed into Amy with a loaded Louis Vuitton bag. I could smell the buttery leather, no Times Square knockoff here. Excuse you, Amy said, nice and icy. Excuse you? The woman barked. Why don't you learn to walk? Learn to look where the fuck you're going. And kept moving, her phone already lighting up in her right hand, her ass sashaying down the street, never missing a step, in heels thin as number 2 pencils. Don't ask me why. I don't know. Next thing, I ran up behind her, sunk my hands into her blonde, highlighted top knot, and yanked down as hard as I could, fire alarm style. The woman swung her bag and whacked my head. A hot tingle spread across my shoulder, up into my neck, my face. It burned, then ached with a coming bruise. Already bent halfway down, I groped for her left tit and squeezed it as hard as I could. Amy grabbed and twisted her other boob. Ow, shit, what the fuck, she snarled. Fucking bitches, let go. In the middle of our wriggling, stomping feet, her phone fell. Up vined my whiny voice. Say you're sorry. With one hand, I covered my head. The fingers of the other jabbed into the woman's ribs, into her lace bra's underwire. Say you're sorry, Amy growled. The woman's arms, windmilling crazily, pounded us on our backs. Who the fuck do you brats think you are? Amy's foot found the fallen phone. She smashed her heel into the screen and twisted like she was making fresh guac in a mortar. At this threat to her iPhone, the woman's face transformed. A dark cloud of fear and horror, like she expected me or Amy to next pull out a knife, a gun, something that would make the hair-pulling and tit-grabbing child's play. Just say it. It's an easy word. Sorry. Instead, she yelled, police, help, police, I'm being attacked. Lights flashed on in 2 or 3 ground floor apartments. Amy let go, and so did I. The force of our release hurled the woman backward onto the concrete. Who are we? Amy said, grabbing my hand. I'll tell you who the fuck we are. The future. Thank you.
Wow. With that amazing reading to set the tone, we have about a half hour to hear you all talk about translation and creative writing before hearing from Achy read. And after that, we'll have an audience Q&A. So audience, please jot down any questions you might have and save them for the end. And meanwhile, Adrienne and Achy, I'm going to toss out a couple questions that you can take up if you'd like to discuss. So in what ways can original writing, work, and translation mutually inform each other? How might we consider creative writing a translational process and translation a process of creative writing? How even might the concept of original and its supposed opposite copy dissipate when we look closely at the creative processes at the heart of these writing practices? In what ways can both of these practices push the limits of language and culture? And then how do translation and writing interact institutionally across academia, publishing, and other media outlets? How does engaging in creative writing and translation inform how you engage institutions in the presentation and circulation of your work? We're so excited to hear from both of you.
I think that is so much. That's like a universe of questions. But for me anyway, I find that the two feed each other. for me, writing and translation are, they're separate, but they have an incredibly interwoven relationship. I know that I've learned to consider language in a very different way by virtue of the fact that I do translation. With translation, you know, precision is crucial. You have to know what is being said, and you have to understand it well enough to have, you know, a comfort level, not just to bring it into the other language, but to bring it into the other language creatively. And I think that has helped me slow down and reconsider my own work when I write. I've also learned to play. I've also learned to play a lot by virtue of translation. I mean, one of my most favorite things to do sometimes is to, especially with poetry, is to take stuff I've written and throw it up on, I know this is gonna sound insane, but throw it up on Google Translate and like have it go from English to Croatian, and then Croatian to Korean, and then Korean to Spanish, and then, you know, Spanish to Greek, and then bring it back to English like 10 translations later. And it's a completely different ball game. Half of it doesn't make any sense, but it gives me ways to reconsider some of the things that I've written, you know, when I have it go through these different filters. So for me now, these two practices are very related and very much a part of my you know, my quill. You know, I mean, I just pull those arrows out as I need them. They feel as much a part of the practice as my laptop and my felt pens and all that other good stuff. What about you, Adrienne?
I love what you're saying. One of the things that came up for me as you were speaking is that I feel like I'd been doing writing, and I feel like I kind of came late. I don't think the phrase late bloomer is pejorative. I have a friend that I called myself a late bloomer at one point. She's like, don't say that. And I was like, no, I think I'm just like, I want to be like blooming at 95. So
I'm with you. I am also a late bloomer. So I very much appreciate all of that.
yeah. So, you know, so here I am, I'm like in my mid 30s and I'm starting to do this PhD program, and I really didn't ever study English before. And I'd been doing writing, but I felt like translation was what really made me think about language. And there was also a lot flying around in workshops, in conversations with colleagues, that it would sort of feel like I would just be like, something's not quite right there. Like there's something we're not thinking about. There was a way that the way that often will sort of like be shown somebody's writing in a workshop, or we'll read our own work. And there's this sort of move toward being coherent and the language sort of being smooth and polished. And it just felt really wrong to me. And I felt like it was at the expense of maybe the more important things were happening in people's texts. And so I started hanging out with these translators in Houston, and I was like, these are the freaks that I want to, you know, that I want to be with, because their relationship to language, these are my people. There was a whole other relationship to language that was coming out there, a kind of like, let's really get to know this tool. Let's really see what it can do. I felt like I was around a bunch of people who were, they were really not just interested in sort of like making something beautiful, but thinking about their work in a way that I did, with a kind of critical lens, and and a lot of generosity and playfulness too, that I wasn't finding among some of my colleagues. That was really important for me. The other thing that comes up, and so this is, I don't think, in necessarily direct response to one of your questions, Liz, which are wonderful. But for me, there was also this way that as I began to do work in translation, it was the first time that I felt like this sort of creative and intellectual task was mirroring for me what it felt like to be in the world. So what it meant to be a mixed race Black kid from Wyoming, and to sort of be navigating and moving through these different spaces, it sort of gave me like a physical embodied experience of what that was like. And that's another reason why I think I sort of, it's kind of like when you're in the pool and maybe you're not a great swimmer and somebody like throws out a noodle or something and you're like, thank you, let me take that, because I'm going to really enjoy this space and I'm going to be here much more now, but without being frantic. And so translation and thinking about its relationship to my creative writing, I think there are a lot of things that I wouldn't have found language to say or write without having had that sort of embodied experience through the act of doing translation. So I don't know if that feels like, if that resonates with you at all, Achy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and when you talk about being a biracial kid from a Black kid from Wyoming, I mean, I'm imagining that you've been translating your whole life. I know that as an immigrant kid, I was literally translating for my parents. Back in the day when we first came to the States, you couldn't just dial and make a phone call to Cuba. It was actually an incredibly long process. You had to place the call with an overseas operator. You had to, all this stuff. And my parents didn't actually have the language proficiency to be able to improvise on a transaction like that. So I would end up doing that. But I mean, I was also doing that at the post office, and I was also doing that. And I never thought of those things as translation. But so we all kind of do that in some ways, I think. But what I was going to say is also that in a broader response to what you're saying is that for me, one of the things that translation does is it forces me to think about things, very differently. I remember I think it's the first time I ever was really stumped by a translation. There's a poem of Borges's in, I think it's The Gold of the Tigers. And the last line in the Spanish, the original, is "Me duele una mujer." If you translate that literally, it's like "a woman hurts me," but obviously you can't say "a woman hurts me" because it sounds like a woman is like, literally, like hammering you or punching you or something. And that's not what he meant. He meant this very notion, this very idea of this person, like causes an ache in him, causes a longing in him. But none of what I've just said fits the poem, fits and the book that I saw this in was a bilingual book, with face-to-face pages. And it was by one of these illustrious dudes that Borges played with, when he did translated work, Rabassa or Alistair Reed or one of these guys, one of the eminences. And I just thought he had it wrong, whatever it was. And I've never been able to come up with a line for that. But every time I think about that, it makes me think of all the untranslatables, the concepts that only exist in certain languages, the way that we see and hear and function in different languages. One of the other things that always sort of like me is that in Spanish, there's no word for heaven. It's the same word as sky. And I think of that as a very strange idea that we don't have this notion of heaven. I mean, we're a spiritual people, regardless of faith. We're deeply influenced by African languages, and we pick up a lot of things from African languages in the Caribbean, and African languages do have words for, Yoruba has a word for heaven, Igbo has a word for heaven. These are like the major languages of the slaves in the Caribbean. The continent is influenced by, Guarani and Nahuatl and all these other languages. And yet Spanish, even though it's willing to integrate concepts from these other languages, has never integrated, has never accepted, has never brought in, has never embroidered into its fabric a word for this other place, this divine place, this other world, And what is our limitation? What is the cultural, thing that keeps us from imagining that place? These are questions that that always haunt me?
My mind is blown. It's up there in it's up there in the heavens. The
For which we have no word.
For which we have no word. Improvise. Do your best. Yeah, I mean, I think that those kinds of questions, which feel like they're at once about, they're about a word, but they're about everything else at the same time, that I think that those are the sorts of questions that really opened up for me in translation too. I had never sort of really thought about theory, and I had this one professor in college, and he just was like, he would like bring red wine and Oreos to the last day of class. Believe me, I think it's a good combination if you're into it. And he just was somebody who was like, ideas can set you free, or just like really thinking about them, really not just thinking about, but letting thinking be like a state of being. So to take something like this question of like, why don't we have that word? What does that mean? What, here are all these other points of intersection. What's that about? Like, that's a whole vocation, and that we might not be brought to it without doing this work with language, and without sort of thinking about what's happening here that maybe isn't happening there, or this other place that I'm, trying, or this what you were talking about with Borges, like there's just not, I don't have a knife here, like like me duele una mujer. One of the things I was thinking about today regarding this conversation, and I don't think it's directly related, so I don't want to suggest that this is what you were necessarily talking about, Achy, but I feel like for me, thinking about the relationship between creative writing and translation has also been an important place to really think about failure and being and embracing failure. Like there's a way that I think, certainly given, think about like given my ambitions as a creative writer, or given the context that I've been in, failure feels like something that hasn't been embraced. And I always would hear people talk about like embracing failure. And I was like, that sounds good, but I better not try and do that, because because then like what happens after that? The self is obliterated. But I felt like through really failing in translation, it was like working another kind of muscle as a sort of thinker, sort of person that I wanted to be. And I don't know if that's sort of like a bad trip to put on like the text that, I'm translating, but I just think maybe that's also where spaces of playfulness come in, because it's like, I take myself less seriously, or I understand that there's like not just one option here, that there's actually like, even though I'm searching for, that understanding or precision, that this isn't, there's not just this one rodeo. And I wondered what you thought about that sort of space of like failure and maybe playfulness. I don't know.
I think one of the things about, for me, when I translate, is that I always sort of assume that I'm going to make it better in some ways, and I'm not going to be able to really do it justice in other ways, and I end up sort of just telling myself, okay, this is, it has to do with the limitations of language. It has to do with my limitations as a translator, and it has to do with my limitations as a writer. I do think that the better you are as a writer, the better you're going to be a translator, because you have some sense of more than meaning. You have a sense of rhyme and sound and voice and cadence, and you have all those, you have the muscle memory of written creativity. And so you are not, it isn't mechanical. It becomes this other spiritual thing, and you feel the muses. But even if you're fantastic at it, I think that there will always be something that doesn't quite, do what you want it to, or certainly what the original wants it to. Original. It's also, I think it's also very peculiar to be a writer and a translator, to be a published writer, a writer with a writing career, and then to also have, a translation career, because I know that I approach that original like it's Holy Scripture.
Yeah.
I want to be, just the funnel, the transmitter for this piece, especially when it's work that I absolutely adore, or if I'm translating for someone I know and am friends with. And I also think it's important to know your limitations. Like one of my very best buddies is Carolina's de Robertis, and she has a new novel coming out in August, The President and the Frog. It's exquisite. And she called me and she said, I'd love it if you would do the translation. Please do the translation. And, Carolina is from Uruguay. I am from Cuba. And I'm pretty flex, and, drop me in Buenos Aires for a couple hours and I sound just like an Argentinian, I am like a sponge, but I cannot do Uruguay, not without suffering a lot. And as much as I love this, it's my favorite Spanish regional variant, but I just can't do it. So I'd say no, because it's a limitation. I can't, that's not a Spanish I can do. I know that about myself, and I don't want to translate her work into a neutral Spanish because it would lose its flavor in so many ways. Plus, this is a novel that's steeped in modern Uruguayan history. It can't take place anywhere else, so it has to be, the voice has to be true, the sound has to be authentic. You have to hear the music that the Uruguayans, have the melody of their Spanish in order for it to even get close. So those are, that to me is like a total failure. I would love to do Carolina's novel, but I can't even get out the door. I can't even turn the page.
I love that. I think, that sort of reckoning with a limitation, and just sort of thinking, this is not, I can't, like, to understand that in taking on translation, just generally, that there will be something that I'm not able to fully do, or like, I'm kind of where I am, I'm doing the best I can. I think I've got, my sense of what's happening in the text. But there's going to be some space for failure. But the difference between that and then just thinking, I just should not take this on. This is for other hands than mine. Yeah, I feel like for me, my first and sort of ongoing translation project, which just feels like, when you talked about it as sort of a spiritual process, was to do these translations of writers who were in the French Resistance, and most of the poems are anonymous. They're not, and they're by women. They haven't been translated, many of them by people. And I just felt like this was, for me, a space to sort of have communion with people across time, and to sort of stop.
The beauty of dead writers.
Yeah.
They don't argue.
The beauty of dead writers, they don't argue. But I also think that for me, and this may sound totally witchy poo, and that's fine, but I think that I was always that sort of kid that was like, there's something else going on. And I know that if I could just hit the right frequency, I could be talking to people from like Tyrannosaurus Rexes to, to the 19th century.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's sort of the way that translation feels like it can also give me this ability to sort of do what I wanted to do when I was trying to build a time machine as a little girl, which was to move across time and space. That there's a way that I can do that in a text, even though, it's not anything I'm trying to publish. I'm just trying to learn. I'm just trying to sort of to apprentice myself to a text. So I really like what you're saying, and I'm taking it with me.
I think it's really interesting. I know so many translators that have these like soul projects that aren't really about publishing, that they're just things that they do sometimes, you know. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the translation of Black writers into Spanish. My sort of moment of, oh no, was when I stumbled across a Spanish language version of Beloved and discovered that, first of all, it was translated in Spain into a peninsular Spanish that doesn't use tú. It uses vos, which is a high register, very white Spanish. But that wasn't the worst part of it. The worst part of it was that, never mind that there was no Black vernacular in Spanish at all, but the word slave was translated as servants, servientes, undermining the entire premise of the society that she's describing. Just inherently proposing an agency on these characters that they didn't have. So, I mean, no wonder I know people who don't read English and go to me, I don't get what's so special about her. Maybe I'm just missing something. I'm going, oh my God, yeah, you're missing everything. You're missing absolutely everything. And there are so many Spanish Black vernaculars that could be used, you know. I mean, obviously the Caribbean is probably the most represented in the United States, but there are others. You know, there's you know, the Peruvian Black Spanish. Then, in fact, there's a whole dialect of created by Peruvian drag queens, which is really interesting, and you know, really sort of tries to do this gender neutral thing in a very creative way. So to me, this is like the shocking thing. And so I spent a lot of time, well, a lot of spare time, whatever that means, you know, sort of dicking around with these little passages from, you know, books and poems by Black writers that have been translated into English, and these really flat, neutral white voices. And then how to recover that. I don't know. I think there's probably a collective project in here. At some point I should just draft people to help me with this, and maybe, I don't know, take it to Creative Capital and see about it. But you know, it's just something. I mean, no wonder Black writers don't get the recognition among Spanish readers when the voices are so stripped of the very spirit that, you know, that makes them so phenomenal, that, you know, the source of their magic, the source of their pain and inspiration.
Well, and I think, you know, that's just, it's a stunning example. It reminds me of when I went somewhere in the South and they were like, the help. I was like, who are you talking about? Okay, I think I know what you mean. But, you know, so that feels like, you know, on a scale way beyond failure, this like complete misreading, abdication of responsibility to the text, you know, historical context, all these sort of things. And so, but I think you're, you know, part of what you're also saying is that, but it's all around, you know, it's all around in terms of literature, but it's all around in terms of all these other ways in which we're
absolutely
abdicating responsibility to each other and to each other's stories and voices. You know, one of the things that comes up several times in your wonderful questions, Liz, and I've loved that you do this actually original. I maybe we have to talk a little bit about just our sort of feelings about that word, or our, you know, our kind of, and I mean, I think especially when thinking about creative writing and translation, because there's so much sort of like, well, you know, that it's not original work, or that translation's not creative writing, which I think that people in this room would certainly argue with, right? And so I just sort of wondered, is it like even language that you use, or do you feel like I always need to put it in sort of my air quotes? I'm curious to know what you think.
Well, I mean, I do think that I do think there is an original.
Yes.
You know, I tend to put it in quotes because I think there's a process of translation that changes the story in some ways. It depends, you know, and I think you know, it's hard to say exactly what I mean here, but I think, you know, I'm not somebody who, when I translate, I try to be very faithful to the original, especially, but I'm more tending to be faithful to the intent of the original. Like when I translated Junot, it was very, very, very important to sound Caribbean. He'd had a not great experience with his first book and the translation there. The first translation, there were two translations of his first book. The first one was in a peninsular Spanish that sounded like as if Toni Morrison had been translated into Cockney English. It was so bizarre. And my dad, who was, you know, a Spanish speaker, dominant Spanish speaker, started to read it in Spanish and kicked it back and said, I can't, it's unbearable, you know. And then his second version was a very valiant attempt to recover that, and it was very neutral. So Junot came out of it wanting it to be very Caribbean. But the thing is that about 18% of that book was already in Spanish. But it wasn't the kind of Spanish that you necessarily speak in Latin America. It was a very Americanized Spanish. You know, no problema is in Spanish, but nobody in Latin America says no problema. Okay, to begin with, nobody has that stupid accent. So what to do with that Spanish, and then how to give that same sense of bilingualness to a text that sort of resisted the preservation of its original Spanish,
right?
You know, so we had to make other decisions and other choices in some of that, and so there had to be a lot less respect to the original words and a lot more sort of focus on a broader translation, you know, a broader theory of the translation, if you want to call it that. So the original, that doing that translation made me think a whole lot about what the original means, because it wasn't the same as, you know, an instruction manual that you translate. I mean, you really want to make sure that with the instruction manual that everybody knows, you know, that it's button A, you know, but, and you have to respect the original in a completely different way. But this was more organic and more encompassing. It was more than just the word. And that was mind-blowing.
Yeah. I love what you're saying here, sort of the way that this text made you rethink about this question of the original. And I think that sometimes what I hear as subtext when we, you know, conversations, for example, like where I work, I wouldn't necessarily say among my department, my colleagues are awesome, but that the word original is sort of tied to questions of like originality. And so, you know, so I feel like there are all of these other connotations with the word original. And so originality, creativity, all of those sorts of things where it's sort of like, where there's the sense that somehow that work that the translator is doing isn't as original because it lacks sort of originality, which I feel like we've already talked about, that it's full of originality because here is someone encountering this text and they're going through this interpretive process. So I feel like I hadn't really thought about that until you were speaking about the sort of subtext, that all the things that people are saying that they're not saying when they use a word like original. That's great.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt this, but I want us to hear Achy read, and then maybe with a few questions, we can continue the conversation. Would you read to us, Achy?
Sure. I am going to read a poem that's part of a new book that's coming out in September. It's being published by Beacon Press. The book is called Boomerang / Boomerang, and it's a bilingual collection. But this book created a real challenge for me. I decided that I wanted to try to eliminate the binary as much as possible in these poems. Now, in English, that wasn't that terribly difficult. I write in second person, which is already pretty neutral. The use of they as an inclusive noun is now fairly common. Even if people don't use it, they've at least heard of it. They have some opinion about it. Spanish is a very different ballgame. The Spanish is binary. Everything is male or female. And there's an inherent femaleness attached to a sounds, a, and an inherent maleness attached to o sounds, o, which I also find ironic because, of course, in symbology, the o, the circle, is female and comes back to creation and the womb and all that stuff. So what the heck, how did they appropriate that? And Spanish is also inconsistent about stuff. You think, well, it's usually female-y things that get the la, and male-y things that get the el, but it's not true because it's el clitoris. And I'm still trying to figure out how it is that my clitoris is male. I don't know about yours, but mine is absolutely female, and does all those female-y things. So I wanted to do something different. And one of the things that's been happening in Latin America is that there's a big rejection of Latinx. Latinx is considered very American. And the reason for it, of course, is that the X sound is almost impossible to replicate in Spanish. So the convention has been to add the E, to use the E to replace the A and the O. Now, the way it's been used, and there's no uniformity, just to be clear, is to use it only when referring to people. Well, what I did was I used it to refer to all things that were gendered in Spanish, because I don't understand how we're off the binary if we, yes, degender people, but leave my clitoris as male. That doesn't make any sense to me. Why is the couch male? Why is my book male? It's just a book. It actually has no gender. So I'm going to read this poem to you in English, and then I'm going to read it in Spanish. And it's not going to sound like Spanish you've heard before, but just be patient and just give it a shot. We'll see what happens. Okay. The poem is called Slow. The clock of the long now will operate knowing it will lose the correct time, exposed as it will be to imprecise temperatures, stellar and solar alignments, tectonic movements, orbital dynamics, and the fallacies of the human hands that must keep winding it by turning a crank or pulling a chain. In the German village of Halberstadt, at the end of the 20th century, a trust of theologians, composers, and musicians gathered to discuss the 649-year history of the organ, what Mozart called the king of instruments. 3 centuries earlier, in that same German village, a court Jew had defied the authorities by printing 2,000 copies of the 12-volume Babylonian Talmud as a gift to the poor. The Talmud, which runs almost 3,000 pages, can weigh about 30 pounds. That same court Jew had also built a synagogue, Baroque in style and said to be quite beautiful, that stood for more than 300 years until it was demolished in 1938 after Kristallnacht, and from which rose an aircraft factory a few years later, manned by slaves transported from nearby Buchenwald. In that same village, there's a church without a basilica, centuries old, bare and rugged and abandoned, a former monastery and pigsty, constructed out of a harsh, cold stone. The theologians, composers, and musicians built an organ there that kicked off its only concert with a 17-month rest. Its first note came later, like an air raid siren, and played for months and months, heaving and exhaling, crackling and burning. Now, every few years, the villagers, descendants of the court Jew, of those who devastated the synagogue and worked in the factory in Buchenwald, they come and rearrange the 30-pound sandbags that weigh down the organ's pedals. There's a whir and a note is added and the chord changes. Pipes are installed as needed. Each movement will last a lifetime. The clock of the long now will tick once a year. The century hand, which corresponds to the hour hand on a typical timepiece, will move every 100 years. Using the Daf Yomi cycle of a page a day, it takes more than 7 years to read the Talmud, although enlightenment is a different matter. On the planet Venus, a day lasts longer than a year. Here on Earth, blue whales come to the ocean surface mostly at night, their hearts pumping a torpid 4 to 8 beats a minute. Their songs are composed of a handful of notes, but we usually only hear about half of them, the tones dropping into frequencies too low, too deep for us. I am telling you this because time is a ruined fountain, a prayer to the sea, a headfirst dive into stillness. I am telling you this because the universe is at absolute zero until I rise naked to the surface, night or day, and you are there. Lentitud. El reloj de la larga hora ha de funcionar sabiendo que alguna vez perderá la hora exacta, expuesta como estará a temperaturas imprecisas, a aleaciones estelares y solares, a movimientos tectónicos, a dinámicas orbitales y a la falacia de la mano humana, que deberá seguir girando una maníbula o tirando de una cadena para darle cuerda. En la aldea alemana de Halberstadt, a finales del siglo XX, una comisión de teólogos, compositores y músicos se reunieron para discutir los 649 años de historia del órgano, a la que Mozart llamara la reina de los instrumentos. 3 siglos antes, en esa misma aldea alemana, una judía de la corte había desafiado a las autoridades mediante la impresión de 2000 copias de los 12 volúmenes del Talmud de Babilonia para regalarle a los pobres. El Talmud, que tiene casi 3000 páginas, puede pesar alrededor de 30 libras. Esa misma judía de la corte también había construido una sinagoga de estilo barroque que se decía que era hermosa y que se mantuvo en pie durante más de 300 años hasta que fue demolida en 1938, después de la Kristallnacht, y que en ella se erigió años más tarde una fábrica de aeronaves trabajada por esclavos arrastrados desde los cercanos Buchenwald. En esa misma aldea hay una iglesia milenaria sin basílica, expuesta, robusta y abandonada, que también fue un antiguo monasterio y una posilga, construida con piedra áspera y fría. Los teólogos, compositores y músicos construyeron allí un órgano que dio inicio a su único concierto con un descanso de 17 meses. Su primera nota llegó más tarde en forma de una sirena antiaérea que se escuchó durante meses y meses, agitada y acelerada, crujida y incendiaria. Ahora, cada pocos años, los aldeanos, descendientes de aquella judía de la corte de quienes devastaron la sinagoga y trabajaron en la fábrica y en Buchenwald, vienen y mueven las bolsas de arena de 30 libras que presionan los pedales del órgano. Se escucha un zumbido y se agrega una nota y cambia el acorde. Las tuberías se instalan según sea necesario. Cada movimiento durará toda una vida. El reloj de la larga hora hará tic-tac una vez al año. La manecilla del siglo, el cual corresponde a la manecilla de la hora a un iconógrafo común, se moverá cada 100 años. Al usar el método Dafyomi y leer un folio al día, se tarda más de 7 años en completar el Talmud. Sin embargo, la iluminación es asunto diferente. En el planeta Venus, un día dura más de un año. Aquí en la Tierra, las ballenas azules casi siempre suben a la superficie del mar por la noche. Sus corazones bombean entre unos 4 y 8 alertados latidos por minuto. Sus canciones están compuestas por una puñada de notas, aunque generalmente solo escuchamos alrededor de la mitad, ya que los tonos caen en frecuencias demasiado bajas, demasiado profundas para nosotros. Te digo porque el tiempo es una fuente en ruinas, una oración al mar, una inmersión de cabeza en la quietud. Te digo esto porque el universo está en cero absoluto hasta que yo suba desnuda a la superficie de noche o de día y tú estés allí. Thank you. Gracias.
Yay, that was so great. Thank you. We do have some time for questions. So audience members, if you'd like to place questions in the chat. We already had one person ask, where does the experience of axophonic writers fit into this discussion? I'm a bilingual English and Gujarati, a modern Indian language.
I mean, I don't know where the discussion fits in. I mean, I'm technically axophonic. My mother tongue is Spanish. I learned English later, and I write and go back and forth. I think most axophonic writers I know are very much immersed in that second language. I mean, they usually speak that second language like a native language. And it feels, comfortable. I don't know what discussion in particular. I wish I had a better sense of what the focus of the question was. Axophonic writers are very common among translators, I think. In some ways, I think we're already deeply immersed in the conversation, frequently leading the conversation, I think.
I don't really have anything to add. I was going to see if Mina was here, if Mina wanted to add something to the question. You know what I mean? To just sort of
absolutely.
Let us know what was on.
I thought I saw her.
Yeah,
I did too.
Yeah, I think. I think Mina had to dip out, but I think you're right, Achy, and I think that if anything, there's the question too of estrangement from these different languages that we have intimacy with also. So it's not just, what do I do if I'm not a native? It's more of, for me at least, thinking of the places of estrangement and intimacy we have with the different languages we work in, because that is always complex.
Yeah, right? I mean, translators are for the most part usually more attached to one language or the other. I mean, in my case, I'm actually more attached to English than to Spanish, which is the language that I was born into and that I sort of grew up with. But it's a pretty close fit. And part of the reason why I'm more attached to English is because my formal education is all in English. I didn't go to school in Cuba. My dad just beat it into me. I don't mean that literally. But so it's a strange thing that in some ways I'm more confident talking about like English structures and English rules than I might be with Spanish. I know that when I edit, like at Netflix, I edit both in English and in Spanish, and I never think twice to check myself with English. I know what I'm talking about, and I know that I know what I'm talking about. But in Spanish, sometimes I will just check just to be sure that when I tell this person, hey, don't do that, this is the rule on that, let's talk about what this means. And that's me, because my education is in English and my Spanish is autodidactic in terms of grammar, in terms of formal usage. I mean, obviously I have no accent, or I don't sound like an American. Cuando yo hablo español, yo sueno cubana, nadie se le ocurre que soy otra cosa. But I don't have the advantage of having had those rules pounded into my head the way they're automatic. I know I before E, except after C.
I have a question for you all, one more. I know I've already thrown so many at you, but Achy brought up the question of erasure in the translation of Beloved. And I'm wondering what possibilities exist in translation editions for pushing texts in order to highlight difference rather than erasing it. So, I'm thinking, in what ways can translation strategies be perhaps problematic or radically helpful for shaping cultures and language in terms of highlighting difference rather than erasing it? And if that's something that you all have thought of. And maybe if you have examples from your own work of pushing a text or even a phrase to make something even more strange.
Well, again, the Junot piece was the Junot pieces, because I've done 2 of them, were really instructive in that sense. We had to make decisions. I mean, one of the more crucial ones was, if you've read the text in English, you know that it's prodigious in its use of the word fuck. And the word fuck is a magical word. It's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective, it's a declaration, it's it's a question, it's it's emphasis, it's de-emphasis, it's all these things. And there is not a single word in Spanish that will do all that work. It just is not there. We scraped the language and it just did not appear. And so we, what do you do with that then? Because that repetition in English is really important to that book. There's almost a beat to it. And the decision I made, that Junot mercifully agreed with, was to leave it in English, but to give it a Spanish spelling. So we wrote it F-O-K-I-N, Foking, because that's how you would say it. You wouldn't say fucking, you'd say Foking. And the decision was made because, frankly, everybody knows that word in English. Everybody who goes to the movies, everybody who, everybody knows that word. Everybody, you have a cousin in Omaha, even if you live in Lima, and that's the English word they've taught you, So also in context, it was pretty clear, so yeah, it looked weird. I mean, it's not in the dictionary, Foking, but it was what was true to the text, and we felt like we didn't leave anything out. So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes you have to invent, you have to go that extra thing. You're not just translating, you're literally inventing in order to get that phrase out, and sometimes you just have to leave things alone. I saw some translations of Nicolas Guillen that Langston Hughes and Ben Carruthers did in early part of the 20th century. And, you know, Guillen made up a lot of words. I mean, people thought they were Yoruba, but they weren't. They were, I mean, Songoro Kosongo just means Songoro Kosongo. Basically means not, it's like fuck, you know? And Carruthers and Hughes just left it alone because what could you do with that? You know, I mean, they didn't know at the time that it was made up words. But it would have changed rhythm. It would have changed everything to try to bring that into, to get rid of those words and replace them with something else, to make those syllables maybe more accessible in some ways. I mean, I don't know, rat-a-tat-tat, whatever. It wouldn't have worked as well. It needed to be Songoro Kosongo. You just have to, every piece is different, you know? Every piece brings new questions, brings new challenges, and you have to be willing to step out in different ways for different writers.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were sharing, Achy, and we've been working a group of folks on this translation manifesto, several people who have been who are in this room right now or were. And one of the things that's coming up for me too is sort of the relationship, even maybe before the translation begins, the actual work of just sort of reading, because I'm thinking about what you described around that experience of reading Beloved with this peninsular Spanish, and how that really seems to do the opposite of what you were talking about, Liz, about like sort of pushing the language and pushing the text into this discomfort that is part of it, that's part of its history, that's part of what it explores. And so I wonder here too about maybe the relationship of like what's happening for the reader, or to think about like this, that it's going to be a reader who's reading Focking, like Fockin, and how that's going to work on them. Because I think sometimes we underestimate readers. And I think there's also a way that just thinking about what their experience will be as they encounter something, or wanting to challenge them. I mean, I feel like this is a time right now where it's so in the world just feels like all hands on deck. And so is there really time to waste in terms of not kind of pushing each other to see and think about and do some of the things that, you know, it's not a time to be shy. It's a time to put Focking in the text and like, and to really sort of not shy away from what the reality that the text itself was bringing, that the original was bringing into the world, and to honor that. I have a thought about that, but I realize we only have a couple minutes left. So I think there was another question.
Yeah, Corinne added a question. It says, authors usually get copyright, translators less often. I'm interested in your feelings as writers, as translators, about how the text you're working on belongs to you or not. And this kind of ties back into some threads you've already picked up on.
Well, I've had both things happen. I wish I owned the Junot translations, because I find those to be really in sort of highlights of my career as a translator. But I was also just kind of coming into it, and I knew I had very little negotiating power in that sense. I think as time has gone on, I've been able to own more and more of my work. I also find that owning the translation is frequently symbolic. You know, I mean, I own those translations. I don't give a damn that it's, you know, copyright to Vintage in Espanol. It's mine. It's spiritually mine. I did it. Tell me otherwise. I mean, what can I not do with those translations? I mean, obviously, I'm not going to publish them on my own, but I mean, I quote them. I use them in class. I want to write a little bit more about translation, about this whole notion of language, and I'm sure I'll quote and think about that, and we'll negotiate permissions. But I feel this very strong spiritual connection to the work I do with translation, even when it's work that's really frivolous. You know, for a while, I was working with a writer named Megan Maxwell. She writes romance novels for Amazon. And, you know, I am not a romance novel reader, so I had no clue that what this really meant was soft porn. So I learned how to say thrust in Spanish in a lot of different ways. And it was a really fascinating experience. Like, yeah, it's not high literature. It's totally frivolous. It's just fun stuff. But I still learned from those translations. And in the end, actually, I did think I did like 3 or 4 for Megan. And, you know, I ended up having such respect for her by the end of it, because she's such a phenomenal storyteller. I mean, if she ever walked away from that soft porn stuff and just wrote a straight up literary novel, she'd probably knock it out of the park, except, you know, she's making so much money with the thrusting that, you know, she's happy, I guess. Anyway, I don't know. I feel I own them anyway. Adrienne, I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, you know, I'm in my baby translator phase. So I've never, you know, I don't have a book, for example, that's sort of out there that that hasn't belonged to me. But as I read that question, what comes up for me is, yes, it does. It belongs to me. Like, I did that work. I spent that time. I feel like the word devotion has come up for me a lot in just sort of this conversation. And for me, the active devotion is really important. And sort of being devoted to a text and seeing something through. I would almost feel like, you know, having a really intimate moment with somebody and then like you don't see them for a while in public, it would be like, I have to say hello to you, or I'm like not actually a good human being. I need to just acknowledge your presence. Like, we shared something. So I feel like it does. I mean, it does belong to me. Like you were saying, actually, like there's a sort of spiritual level, but I'm also like, yes, and I should get full credit for it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, and I know, yeah.
I think things are changing for translators. I mean, I know when I was a kid, I would frequently look for translators and you couldn't find the credit, you know. I think giving translators credits, and not just on the copyright page,
Right.
You know, is becoming more and more common. I remember having to originally like really press that it needed to be, you know, on an authorial page. And then now it's just standard. It's just not something that I ever discuss with anybody, of course, you know, and they send me the title page and, you know, I okay it or whatever. Just like royalties for translators used to be like, oh, you know, only, you know, I don't know, Rabasa gets, you know, royalties. And, you know, I know Amazon is the evil empire, but when it comes to Amazon Crossing, their translation division, they actually have done a lot of good for translators, because they've made royalties pretty standard, and they've made living wages more common, and they've pressed other publishers. I recently, like 2 years ago, did something for one of the majors in New York, and the last time I'd worked for them, they literally laughed at me when I asked about royalties. And this time around, they offered royalties. They offered a pittance, but the concept had been completely, you know, rethought. It was now part of the conversation at the very least, which I think is a healthy thing. So I do think the future is a little brighter in that sense. I personally love seeing the royalties roll in every month from Amazon, even if it's only $45.29, you know. So as time goes on, it gets a little bit less. But it's you know, it's yeah, you did your work, you're doing your work was worthwhile, you should be paid for it. And you wrote too. If the author's getting royalties, you should get royalties.
Yeah, it would be interesting to think if in 5 years if we revisited this part of the conversation,
Yeah.
would the needle have moved even more?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, on that note, we have to end. We're out of time, but thank you both so much. Thanks to all of you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, of course, of course.
And Adrienne, great to meet you.
Oh, lovely to meet you too.
Let's
Thank
do this
you.
again post-COVID over coffee.
You got it.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yes,
Thank
be
you.
well. Thank you so much.